This week on Let's Talk About Mental Health, I'm talking about overcoming addictions. So let's get talking. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 34 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the weekly podcast about improving your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin. Thank you for joining me. This week I'm talking about addiction. I'll be discussing the impact of addiction on you and those you care about, how you can identify if it's time to do something about it, how to tackle addiction, and how to support someone else who might be struggling with addiction. So, let's talk. I decided to talk about addiction this week because this episode goes out on July 6, which happens to be my birthday, and no, I'm not fishing for birthday wishes, but it's also my 2-year anniversary of quitting drinking. For a long time, I thought that I had my drinking under control. However, if the last 2 years have proved anything to me, it's that when it comes to addiction, it is amazing the things that we can justify to ourselves if we try hard enough. Since becoming sober, I've come to accept just how much damage I was doing to my mental health by drinking, and just how important it is to talk about these sorts of things openly and honestly, which is what I'll be discussing this week. Now, I'm going to be looking at addiction in general, from substances to food, from gambling to shopping, and I promise you that this won't be an episode full of me lecturing you on why you must tackle your demons immediately. Instead, what I'm going to be doing is giving you some things to think about, and then it's up to you to do with that what you will. No amount of lecturing is ever going to make someone change. Dealing with addiction is a very personal thing, and there are usually deep-seated reasons why people do things that aren't in their best interests. So I'll be challenging you to think about the choices that you make and what impact those decisions have on your life, as well as providing some general advice around what to do if you have somebody in your life who has an addiction. And so a lot of this episode, if that is the case for you, if you're listening to this because you want to understand somebody in your life that has or may have an addiction, a lot of this is about you understanding the background information before we get into the how-to component. So let's start with some definitions and background information about addiction. So what is addiction? Simply put, addiction refers to a compulsive habit or behavior, and it often refers to a dependency on a specific substance. There are many different types of addiction: food, alcohol, drugs, smoking, shopping, gambling, etc. Addiction is extreme behavior. Too much of anything leads to excess, and there's a wise old proverb that says, even nectar is poison if taken to excess. When an addiction is based on substance abuse, it can result in changes and serious damage to the brain as well as other organs in the body, and substance abuse is a major cause of mental illness. There's also evidence to suggest that people dealing with mental health issues may have a higher likelihood of developing substance abuse. So it's a little bit of a chicken or egg thing in that mental illness can contribute to substance abuse, for example, as being a coping mechanism, or having a substance abuse issue can then lead to mental health issues. Either way, it makes sense when you think about it. For a lot of us, our addictive behaviors are things that we do to self-soothe. And when those behaviors tip over into being unhealthy because of their frequency or impact, or both, that's where we start having more and more issues, and so it can become a downward spiral. Let me share some statistics around addiction and substance abuse. Now, this data is Australian, and it's sourced from Health Direct, and I'll put the link in the transcript. But even though it's specific to Australia, I've noticed that when I've done a bit of research and looked at other countries, this seems to be pretty similar to most English-speaking countries, give or take a percentage point here or there. So this data should give you at least a broad idea of the prevalence, regardless of where you live. So, around 1 in 20 Australians has an addiction or substance abuse problem, so that's roughly 5% of the population. The most commonly abused substances in Australia are tobacco and alcohol. Smoking is the single most preventable cause of sickness and death. Around 13% of Australians aged 14 and over smoke every day, and smoking causes almost 8% of the burden of disease in Australia. Just under 1 in 6 Australians drink at risky levels. Alcohol can lead to the short-term risk of accidents, injuries, or violent behaviour, as well as long-term medical complications, such as liver disease and mental disorders. And finally, drug use disorders include the misuse of illegal drugs, such as cannabis and amphetamines, as well as the use of prescription medicines like painkillers or sedatives for non-medical reasons. People who use illegal drugs have much higher rates of mental illness than the rest of the population. The most commonly used illegal drugs in Australia are cannabis, ecstasy, cocaine, and methamphetamines. And again, that source is from Health Direct, and I'll include the link in the transcript. I think it's fair to say that many types of addictions affect a lot of people, and they have some major impacts. And so the question becomes, why do we develop addictions? Many people become addicted to things because they're seeking escape from physical or emotional discomfort, or both. And that's based on an article from Harvard Health, which the link is in the transcript. Addiction used to be seen as a sign of weakness or as a sort of personal failure, but more and more health professionals now recognise that addictive behaviour and mental health often go hand in hand. It doesn't really matter what the type of addiction is, as noted in the same Harvard article that I just quoted from, and let me quote a section for you. Ultimately, addiction is about the complex struggle between acting on impulse and resisting that impulse. When this struggle is causing suffering related to health, family, work, and other activities of everyday life, addiction might be involved. So then how do you know if you have an addiction? Well, according to an article from Your Health in Mind, at the start, you might notice problems with close relationships and your moods. As addiction gets worse, you might need more to get the same effect, have withdrawal symptoms or feel sick if you stop, sometimes use more than you mean to, prioritize the addiction over other things, keep going even though you know it's bad for you or others that you care about, or try to cut down but can't. And the link to that article is in the transcript. Now that second last point is an important one. Keep going even though you know it's bad for you or others that you care about. This is where addiction, regardless of what type of addiction it might be, this is where it starts to move into really damaging territory. When we do whatever it is that we're doing to ourselves, even when we can see the damage it's doing to us and to those we love. Over the past few months, I have relapsed into food addiction as a coping mechanism due to stress. I can see the damage I'm doing. When you try to put clothes on and they don't fit anymore, or you look at your fingers and they're getting quite chunky, it becomes pretty obvious. But it's like one part of my brain is being rational and I can see all the negative effects, while the other part of the brain just tunes it out and tells me to eat. So how do you identify if it's time to do something about an addiction? Well, much like me with my current relapse into food addiction, you probably know if your behaviour is causing negative effects on your life. It's a matter of being brutally honest and completely self-aware. I could sit here and give you 3 hours worth of points about how to work out when it's time to make a change, but I'll just boil it down to this. If you've ever thought that you should make a change because your behaviour is unhealthy, then it's time. Should you make the decision before it reaches that point? Absolutely. Will you? Probably not. We tend to ignore the consequences of our actions until they start to have a detrimental effect on our lives. So even though it would be wonderful if we could all get our shit together before we develop a problem, we usually don't. I mean, I talk about making healthy choices for the sake of your mental health a lot in this podcast, and I'm sitting here with a relapse into food addiction. So I'm no saint when it comes to this. Addressing an addiction is a choice, and nobody can make that choice for you but you. And so with that said, let's get into the how-to part of this week's episode. There are 3 main components to tackling addiction: contemplation, action, and perseverance. Let me start by exploring contemplation, and we're going to spend a fair bit of time in this part before we go to the other 2 components. So the first step of contemplation is making the decision to change. Until you decide that you want to change, you will have no reason to change, and therefore the addiction will likely continue. But when you decide that you want to change, suddenly you'll start thinking through what that change might be. For example, will you cut back on the habit or will you quit it entirely? At this point, I would suggest spending a bit more time in this contemplation stage, which I'm going to be exploring further in a moment, rather than just then jumping into action. You probably know by now just how much I love to remind you that failing to plan is planning to fail. And a huge part of planning is about understanding where you are today and why, so that you can address the root cause of the situation. And so with that in mind, the next step is to take time to understand why the behavior or addiction is happening in the first place. Now, this takes real work. You can have one of those aha moments, but let's be honest here. How many times in our lives do we have one of those great big epiphanies about something, and yet we find ourselves months or even just weeks later going back to the same behavior? That happens because we haven't spent enough time digging into the why behind our situation and really confronting what we're doing and what's underneath it. So for example, with my falling back into emotional eating at the moment, I know that I do that when the anxiety and insecurity becomes so overwhelming that something in me shifts and it's like a switch goes off, and suddenly I snap and I go into overeating mode. Now, while I'm doing it, I am completely rationally aware of what I'm doing to myself, and I will sit there and point out the negative effects that my behavior is having on myself, but it's like my mind just overrides it completely. I did it with drinking, I did it with smoking, I did it with overspending, and those are things I've gotten under control, but I still do it with overeating. Every time I've overcome an addiction, which has been all of those except the food one, which I'm back to working on now, I've used my favorite self-awareness technique, which is the 5 whys, and I've mentioned this in earlier episodes. It's a technique for digging into the root cause of why the behavior is happening. So I'm actually going to cover that quickly now to explain the technique and how it can work for you to help you better understand why you might be struggling with behaviors or addictions that are having a negative impact on you. Again, I know I've discussed this in earlier episodes, but I think it's a good topic to revisit it on. So the idea of the 5 whys is it's like when you go to the doctor. A good doctor won't just treat your symptoms, but they'll run tests to identify what your disease is or your condition so that they can then treat that. Because if you just treat the symptoms instead of the root cause, then problems are liable to crop up again later, or the condition may worsen. If you're dealing with some form of addiction, you can ask yourself why, and then once you have an answer, consider that answer and ask yourself, why is that the answer that I gave? And continue doing that for 5 times, which will usually allow you to develop a much deeper understanding and get you far closer to the root cause of your issues than if you were to just deal with the initial symptom. I'm going to do a real life example now, which is me asking myself a series of questions about why I've relapsed into food addiction. So this could either be helpful or it could be gross oversharing. We'll see which one it is. But this is an opportunity for you to hear the process in action. All right, what is my issue? My issue is I've relapsed into overeating and it's been getting worse for the past few months. Why is that happening? Well, I've been feeling stressed out and anxious with everything that's going on. And why is that? For most of the year, I've been feeling on edge and I feel like I'm treading water and it's, one major event after another, both at home and in the world. Okay, so why have I felt on edge? Well, I had all these plans for my work, which took a really hard left when COVID hit, and it's taken me a few months to get back on track, albeit now in a somewhat new direction. And at the same time, I couldn't save my cat and it broke my heart. And I've been feeling adrift because I had a really particular set of goals in mind, which became impossible because of a number of factors. Okay, so why has that triggered overeating? Well, food has been a constant challenge in my life. When I was a child, I would often take comfort in food when I was feeling unsafe, which was often. So why has that happened again? Well, I've been feeling anxious and always on edge about losing control. And so eating has given me some sense of comfort, even if it's not particularly healthy. Okay, so see the difference from the beginning of that to the why number 5? If I just tried to address the overeating thing, it would not tackle the real root cause. I need to address my anxiety issues about control before I can hope to get my eating back into some sort of healthy habit. Because the eating is just a symptom of that much deeper issue, which is manifesting in a variety of ways, including anxiety and overeating. Does that make sense? Look, going through that little exercise just then, I can't say I'm hugely surprised with the outcome. That control stuff for me has actually been a recurring theme. And back in 2011, 2012, when I was mid-breakdown, I was counting random things just like out of nowhere. And I'd be writing out random words that I would hear or think of using my finger or my toe to write it on the sheet or write it in the air. And those are behaviors that my therapist at the time pointed out were about attempting to regain some control and order. It's ironic because I know that we can only control our own words, actions, and feelings. However, when events throw us off course, we can find ourselves trying to take control wherever we can. The thing about these types of deep-seated issues is that if you don't address them, they have a tendency to manifest in many different ways, and they will pop up over and over again until you finally confront it, learn the lesson that you need to learn, and then deal with it. And so it looks like I have some work to do. Now, if you're interested in reading more on the 5 Whys technique, I'll include some links in the transcript that you can have a bit of a look at. So once you understand why your addiction is happening, which is what that 5 Whys technique really helps with, another component of contemplation is to take time to understand the impacts of your addiction. Ask yourself a few questions honestly. First, what impact is my addiction having on my life? Second, what impact is my addiction having on my health, be it physical, mental, spiritual, social, and financial? And third, what impact is my addiction having on my loved ones? You need to be brutally honest with yourself when you do this. No sugarcoating. If your family is having to struggle to make ends meet because you're down the track twice a week gambling away the grocery money, you are having a major negative impact on your family and on yourself. So as part of this exercise, really take the time to understand what you're doing, because you're going to need that knowledge to keep you motivated to make changes in the future. So still in this contemplation stage, the final component of contemplation is to be completely clear about why you want to change. So based on the previous couple of steps, you've just spent a whole bunch of time going through all the stuff that sits under your addiction and what it's doing to you and those you love. So now it's time to be blunt with yourself. Why do you want to change, or why do you need to change? Is it because your health is in serious danger? Is it because it's costing you a fortune? Is it because you're pushing away the people you love? Is it because you're sick of waking up feeling horrendous or having that next day shame feeling when you remember what you did last night? Take all of that stuff that you've just identified and roll it into a sentence or two that makes it really clear why you want to and need to make changes. So once you've spent time in contemplation and you know why you want to change, it's time to get into action mode. First of all, obviously taking action. So that's either cutting back on the habit or quitting it entirely in a safe and responsible manner. Part of that also is about getting support, and especially for serious addictions. For example, gambling or substance abuse. You need to get help. Why? Well, for starters, it could be dangerous and even life-threatening to suddenly quit without proper support, such as if you have to deal with withdrawal symptoms from narcotics. And then the other reason is that quitting on your own is just plain difficult. If you want to have the best possible chance of success, get help. I talked about support back in episode 33, so check that out for more about what to expect. And if you are planning on going to a support group like AA or NA, please do some homework and make sure that you find one that aligns with your personal values and beliefs, since many of them can be religious in nature, so you need to factor that into your thinking. And the reason why I say that is because when you find support options that are in line with your belief system, you'll have a much higher likelihood of success. Another point about taking action is around taking things one day at a time. Who knew I'd bring this one up? Look, overcoming any kind of addiction is a marathon, not a sprint. And especially in the early stages, it can be a case of just making it through not even just the day, getting through the next hour. So take your time and take things one step at a time. And then celebrate milestones. I mean, do you know why AA give out chips for hitting milestones? Because it's a big deal. 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years. Milestones matter because they are tangible evidence of the progress that you've made. So work out what milestones matter to you and celebrate your progress to reinforce your success. And then I mentioned that there were 3 major steps, and the third being perseverance. And so what that means is remembering that recovery happens one day at a time. It's a journey, not a destination, and it takes daily effort and vigilance. If you used to struggle with alcohol addiction, then it's quite possible that you will always be an alcoholic. And so you'll need to accept that fact and remain vigilant for the impact of triggers and setbacks. You will be recovering from addiction for the rest of your life. Instead of fighting that fact, accept it and embrace it. That's why you'll find, for example, a lot of AA or NA sponsors do the things that they do, sponsoring people, because it serves to pay it forward by helping someone else to get their addictions under control. But at the same time, it can remind the sponsor of their own progress. Recovery happens one day at a time. If you do slip backwards, address it hard and address it early. And this is the reason why I list this step as perseverance, because it certainly can take determination and effort to stay on track when you're overcoming addictions. You might relapse, but deal with it quickly and take time to understand why it happened. There might be additional triggers that have come to the surface that you weren't expecting or haven't confronted. Be kind and forgiving to yourself and keep going. I think this quote from Harvard Health about relapse sums it up perfectly. It is important to remember that the process of overcoming an addiction often requires many attempts. Each attempt provides an important learning opportunity that changes experience and, despite the difficulties, moves recovering people closer to their objectives. There are many pathways into addiction and many routes to recovery. Think about recovery from addiction as a 5-year process that will have its ups and downs. After about 5 years, life can and will be very different. As life becomes more worth living, addiction loses its influence. And I'll put the link to that in the transcript. Now, I also talked about recovery back in episode 27, which was a broad conversation about recovery, so you might also find that useful to check out, and the link is in the transcript. Or you can find it at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that I'd also be talking about supporting others through addiction. So, what if it's a friend or a relative who is experiencing addiction? How do you support them? Well, first off, hopefully you've listened to the rest of this episode, because that should begin to give you a bit of an idea of the challenges and issues associated with addictive behavior. Because offering genuine understanding about the difficulties of addiction and being non-judgmental are probably the biggest things that you can do to provide support. Also, you need to know that the person might not see their behavior as an issue. You can choose to be honest with them and explain the effect that their behavior is having on you in a calm and non-judgmental manner, but the decision to change is ultimately going to be up to them. Explain your concerns, encourage them to do something about their addiction, offer support and love, and then give them space to decide what they will or won't do. If they decide to change, ask them what support they would like from you and simply be there for them. Just remember that they have to do the work, not you. And so don't accept responsibility for taking action to address the addiction. For example, if you offer to be the one to drive the person to meetings, then that makes it your responsibility to get them to attend, and that's taking away from the person's ownership of their recovery. Being there for someone means emotional support, love, and encouragement, not doing the work. And what do you do if the person won't do anything about their addiction? Well, that's out of your control, because you can only control your own words, actions, and feelings. And so in that case, you only have 2 choices. You either accept things as they are, or you let go and walk away. That can be painful, especially if the person is someone that you're close to. But the reality is that you need to make the decisions that are right for you. If that's something that you're struggling with, get support to work through it. Talk to a counselor or a therapist. Letting go is painful, and it's something I talked about back in episode 32. Plus, I also discussed dealing with challenging family relationships back in episode 19, so you might find either of those episodes to be helpful. For all of us, when it comes to addiction, what it all boils down to is this. When you have an unhealthy addiction and you choose to continue it, even though you know it's bad for you and the ones that you care about, you are doing harm. Harm to yourself and harm to others. Confronting the truth about our behavior is difficult enough, but often what's more difficult is accepting that we are doing harm. Life is a reasonably simple equation. Make healthy choices, plus do no harm, plus be kind, equals greater satisfaction. And so if you're prone to behaviours that are taking away from your long-lasting satisfaction, then perhaps it's time that you confronted the truth and made a change for the better. It's not easy, but it is worth it. And it begins with the choices that you make today. That's nearly it for this week. Each week I like to share a quote about the week's topic and encourage you to take a few moments to reflect on it and to consider what it means for you. This week's quote is by an unknown author, and it is, "Recovery is not for people who need it, it's for people who want it." Let me repeat that. Recovery is not for people who need it, it's for people who want it. Alright, that's it for this week's episode. Next week, I'll be talking about insecurity. I'll be discussing the common causes of insecurity and ways that you can beat it in order to build greater confidence. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released on Monday morning in Australia and New Zealand, Sunday evening in the UK and Ireland, and Sunday afternoon in the US and Canada. You can find past episodes and additional content at the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. That's letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. You can also find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTA Mental Health. That's at LTA Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice and tell someone that you know about the show, because word of mouth really helps new people to discover the program. Thank you very much for joining me today. As always, look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.